The lockdown files, over 100,000 text messages, 2.3 million words, a team of 7 staff at the Telegraph working day and night to dissect what they found. Now, there were rumors that the Telegraph were working on a top secret and high profile project with a special team of reporters who had been seconded from the main newsroom. It'd been circulating in journalism circles for weeks. But the revelation that the story was a leak of Matt Hancock's private WhatsApp messages took staff at the rival media and Matt Hancock by surprise. But we have to ask questions. Why now? What's it really all about? Is this a controlled demolition of the narrative or a turning point in media scrutiny? Are people like Matt Hancock being thrown under the metaphorical bus to cover some sort of deeper or perhaps darker set of issues or truths? And after all, Matt Hancock does make a rather convenient fall guy. He's already been shunned from his position for his affair, his crazy appearance on I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here, and now this. And during which time he trusts a known lockdown skeptic journalist with access to his private WhatsApp messages to help publish his memoirs. You have to be more than a little suspicious about what's going on here. Yet what is curious is that rather than the media jumping on what is perhaps one of the biggest revelations of our time, they've instead turned on journalist Isabel Oakeshott and made her the story rather than interrogate the contents of the WhatsApp messages themselves. Perhaps it makes it easier for them to ignore their failure to ask the right questions at the right time. Perhaps you could argue that this revelation says more about the media themselves rather than the issue at hand. But the question is this a tipping point? Is this a tipping point for the media? My prediction throughout the entire lockdown charade was that at some point the media would turn. Now, we do know that the media were entirely part of the narrative. They weren't necessarily critical of any of the key information during the course of the lockdowns and other impositions and restrictions. But I did predict that at some point a turning point would occur. The media will play to the story that will guarantee the greatest possible attention and revenue for their papers. But of course, we know the governments and other sources have funded the lockdown narrative for the last few years. But as that funding come to an end, is there now a new opportunity for the media to seek a new form of revenue, new form of attention, but finally lifting the veil on what has gone before us? I predict that time will come, but is it here now? Truth be told, I don't believe it is, because despite the revelations, the media and the public alike seem to be desperate to cling on to the belief that lockdowns were for the greater good, even when the evidence of manipulation is now becoming increasingly clear, let alone the scientific discussion. No one seems to want to believe that they were conned into disproportionate levels of fear. It's embarrassing for some to acknowledge that they were persuaded into unevidenced and sometimes completely irrational behaviors, from wearing masks to standing on spaced dots in shops to staying at home for months. We engaged in many acts of individual and society-wide destruction. It's therefore perhaps easier to believe that they were somewhat necessary and for the greater good than confront the brutal reality that some of these text messages present. You see, the mind only lets you see what it thinks you can handle. It's very traumatic to realize that you were duped by people that you trusted and did things that were damaging to society. So you adopt a psychological defense mechanism such as denial, minimization, rationalization, and projection. And since Matt Hancock's messages have been public, we have certainly seen some of these defense mechanisms kicking in, both in the media and amongst the public. So it seems that the tide of public opinion only flows in one direction. And unfortunately, it seems to be at present the same appears to be true for the media. Now, the hard lesson in this is those who turn a blind eye to history are condemned to blindly repeat it. So it is important that we find a way to take every opportunity of revelation of malpractice or even conspiracy to bring it to light so that we do not repeat the same mistakes again. Now, the question of conspiracy versus incompetence has been long played out over the last couple of years, and I'll touch upon that in closing today because there's been a lot. It's reinstated the debate around to what level of this atrocity was malice and what level was incompetence. But for now, I just want to conclude on the piece around the media. Perhaps the real reason that the corporate reporters are attacking Isabel Oakeshott for the biggest scoop since the Pentagon Papers is because they are embarrassed to have been hoodwinked by the government and the scientific bureaucrats into following the science. Or perhaps is it simply because of the hundreds of millions of pounds that the media received to create the news, not report the news? That's right. We know that the governments and conglomerates like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation paid millions to these newspapers and were a significant source of their revenue during the course of the pandemic. So what hope was there ever to receive any form of independent investigation into what was happening during the course of the pandemic? But who knows? Maybe this is the tipping point. Maybe the funds have run dry and maybe the tide is about to turn. But let's turn our attention onto the lockdown files themselves. Following the science is the message and the mantra that we were etched into our minds throughout the course of the last 2 or 3 years. Now, what the lockdown files reveal is not a government trying in good faith to do what is right for people or trying to carefully balance the good and bad consequences of their actions, or trying to make their interventions track the best available course using the best available science, but rather a government scrambling to save face, stay on the right side of public opinion, score PR points, and avoid political rows and divisions that could play out badly for their careers in the press. There was no clear evidence of any analysis of cost and benefits, appropriateness of policy, proportionality of policy, consideration of collateral damage and long-term consequences. No, none of the above has been shown to even be a factor so far in what we know from the lockdown files. It's seen that Professor Chris Whitty told the then Health Secretary in early April 2020, about a month into the pandemic, that they should be testing the elderly going into care homes. Mr. Hancock, of course, didn't follow this, but none of the attention looks at any of the real counter arguments to these narratives. So whilst testing, with all the flaws that they have, it may have helped save some lives of the elderly who went into these care homes, particularly if they had symptomatic COVID. But what about the deeper questions that need to be asked? The inappropriate restrictions on effective treatments that could have saved lives, anything from therapeutic treatments to zinc, vitamin D, to the controversial ivermectin, the loneliness and despair brought upon by insufficient access to loved ones, the blanket application of do not resuscitate notices to the chronically ill, and perhaps above all, the overprescription to the death pathway drugs like midazolam, and of course, the great big mRNA experiment. Now, all of these may have played a role over the course of the last few years in causing a heightened volume of deaths amongst our elderly. Perhaps not, but when will we ever get an investigation into the facts? What the lockdown files don't show us is that there are any considerations around any of these individual elements, and still the counter narrative is not revealed by these files. Now, leaked messages from December the 13th, 2020 show former UK Health Secretary Matt Hancock planning to deploy the new variant in COVID messaging to frighten, in quote, the pants off everyone in order to get proper behavioral change. Sounds really scientific to me. Now, this was all done to drive compliance with lockdown measures, with no qualms whatsoever about driving the fear-based messaging. This is despite the fact, of course, that psychologists had already warned that some government messaging during COVID, including using alleged fear tactics in poster campaigns, in public health messaging, were grossly unethical and inflated fear levels that would have likely contributed to excess non-COVID deaths and an increased anxiety disorders. But hey-ho, following the science was the message of the day and the most unscientific of forms. Now, Perhaps what's most damning about what the lockdown files have revealed, and it's still early days, 2.3 million words is a lot to read. And, I've been listening into some of the reports from the Telegraph team about the level of depth they've had to go to scrutinize these messages in closed door environments in order to cross-reference and scrutinize and pull together the different threads, looking at individual messages with individuals versus group messages and cross-referencing to points in time. It's no easy feat. But what they have revealed at this early stage is that the lockdown files provide an invaluable and astonishing new insight into the depths of which the British government and its counterparts all over the world sunk to as they weighed the perceptions of these unprecedented, unscientific, futile measures against the opinion of the increasingly terrified and ravenous segment of the public that kept demanding more of these restrictions, while devising ever more manipulative means of terrifying the more skeptical segment of the public into compliance. Hancock discussed blocking funds to get MPs to back lockdown plans. The leak shows that Matt Hancock discussed a plan to block funding for a new centre for disabled children and adults as a way of pressuring a rebel Tory MP to comply and back the new lockdown restrictions. This is one of many revealing text that shows the lengths that the government went to under Matt's tenure as health secretary. We see Hancock talking about deploying the new variant, as I mentioned, as though variants were simply a tool to manipulate the public. We see the cabinet secretary joking with Hancock about important people being put into shoeboxes because of mandatory hotel quarantine policies. We see Hancock very single-mindedly pursuing his testing targets, his arbitrary testing targets, I might add, and apparently subordinating the welfare of vulnerable nursing homes to his desire to meet his wider testing targets. We see Prime Minister Boris Johnson worrying about whether lifting lockdown measures will be well received by the public opinion. He could have, of course, instead worried about the damage that lockdown measures were causing and the violation of human rights and freedoms and the destruction of our human well-being. But no, he was worried about how he might look as a result of the lifting of the lockdown, giving the public sentiment that had been created by this campaign of fear. Mr. Hancock ordered aides to debunk the Sweden argument. Of course, Sweden took a very much lighter approach, not using lockdowns at all and maintaining a high degree of freedom. Hancock ordered his policymakers to scrub that evidence by putting out articles to quash the approach used by Sweden. And we saw senior members of government discussing school masking policies from a purely political and strategic perspective in terms of their visible impact rather than their practical application, to avoid squabbles with Sturgeon in Scotland and the WHO with little regard to the scientific validity. So in summary, the lockdown files, if they've taught us anything, is reaffirmed the nature of our governing bodies and the incompetence and the malice that unfolded during this time. And as I mentioned at the beginning of this episode, it's really brought the discussion of cock-up or conspiracy back to the forefront, because within the nature of the messaging so far, we're not seeing a deep engagement with the third-party stakeholders that many are talking about, whether it's the World Economic Forum or the Gates Foundation. However, I think this is a simple story here that both is true. This is not a case of either or. It's a case of and both. There was certainly incompetence, there was certainly malice, and there were certainly levels of coordinated lockstep approaches across the UK and beyond. Now, thus, insofar the Telegraph fails to shed any light on the activities that led to the initial lockdowns in spring 2020, it's not shed any light on the lab leak story. But the value in the lockdown files so far is the revelations of the political process and the political machine. Now, what the documents do not address is what was deemed to be normal, what was long planned, and what was more novel or unexpected. But no doubt there is further incriminating evidence in these files to emerge. Now, in these sorts of exchanges that were happening at the highest levels of the UK government, it is likely that similar exchanges were happening in other nations We already know, for example, that the US government was colluding with the social media giants to censor their critics, installing the FBI inside of Twitter, for instance. And it's not just that every day a newspaper gets privileged access to this type of material, confidential text messages from a Secretary of State, for example. And it's unlikely that a national COVID inquiry would ever get this level of access or unprecedented access to unredacted confidential communications like this. So the question is, what can we extrapolate from Mr. Hancock's WhatsApp messages, the correspondence with ministers and other elements of the government? What can we deduce about their motivations? And unfortunately, the answer is so far not a whole lot. But this particular data dump should at least make a major dent in the pro-lockdown narrative, as it reveals how callous, inhumane, scientifically uninterested, and shamelessly self-serving that some of the leading decision makers were in one of the nations that ended up with the dubious honor of helping to pave the way for prolonged lockdowns across the world. That said, some of the Telegraph's revelations of what happened, such as Hancock's desire to deploy the new variant to frighten the pants off the public, are perhaps so damning that even the most pro-lockdown supporter will begin taking seriously the question of why this all happened, as well as what went before us. So, in summary, what have we learned from the lockdown files? Well, in some ways, not a lot, but in some ways, we've gained an awful lot of ground here too. My wife, when she first learned of the lockdown files, said, Dan, this just confirms everything that you've been talking about for the last 2 or 3 years. And, you know, there's no celebration to be taken from that fact. There are some of us that throughout the last period of time had the willingness to challenge narratives, to ask questions where others simply wouldn't. And there is no celebration to that fact. The reality is here, in order for us to move beyond this, we do need to pursue a form of accountability. We do need to use revelations like this to drive the story forward in pursuing a level of truth and accountability and justice to make sure that this never happens again. What will come from the lockdown files, who knows? But it's clear that so far, the expected shaking of the ground as a result of their revelation has yet to prove fruitful in the wider conversation. But perhaps this is just the beginning. Is this a tipping point? Is this the beginning of the end? Will we start to see new accountability, new evidence, or will the defense mechanisms simply continue to rise? You tell me. Let me know in the comments. Thank you very much for tuning in to today's episode, examining the lockdown files. Watch this space. As soon as the story unfolds, we'll be bringing you the latest information here on the Elevate podcast with me, Dan Astin-Gregory. And if you're not part of our community yet, please head over to weareelevate.org, where you'll be able to continue the conversation. And tonight, we're inviting our supporters to join the conversation after this episode. So if you'd like to take advantage of being part of the discussion, you'd like to meet like-minded people to explore these issues, then why not join us for a future live podcast where you can meet other members of the Elevate community and join the discussion. And the next opportunity is coming up just tomorrow now, where we're having a conversation about the financial reset and how one can prepare for what it could unfold as the markets begin to shift. What can you do to safeguard your assets and protect your financial well-being? And what opportunities might arise? So join me at 8 o'clock tomorrow evening on Wednesday, the 8th of March, with my guest host, Sam X, as we explore how to navigate the financial reset. Head over to weareelevate.org/financial reset to join us for our very next episode of the Elevate podcast. Thanks very much for tuning in. I'm now off to talk with our community members. Thank you so much for watching. Please share this episode.